Welcome back, listeners, to another edition of Interventions and Detentions with your host, Brad, coming at you with Season 2, Episode 23. I can't even imagine that we're at Episode 23, but I don't have to imagine because we're here. This is it. It's Season 2, Episode 23, and we're going to be talking about the topic of recess today. Recess matters more than you think, more than we think. We're going to just jump right into it. We're going to talk about that single topic that every adult listening probably has an opinion about. Now, just stop and pause for a second, because when I say that word recess, your brain probably takes you somewhere. What does that word make you think of? Maybe it was that kickball game. Maybe it was Foursquare. Maybe it was lining up along that cracked blacktop waiting for someone to pick teams. Maybe it was just that feeling when the whistle blew way too early and you were just now getting warmed up. For me, it was that memory of that crushed limestone-covered playground area alongside a roughly paved blacktop area. It was jumping out of the swings to see who could fly the farthest and the longest and still stick the landing. It's timing the swinger to run underneath them as they go high in the air and hopefully not get kicked in the head in the process. It's that two-handed touch football game that always turned into tackle by the end of recess. For me, it was thoughts of flirting with new crushes, like fifth grade, let's say, or the heartaches that came with it that were delivered from their friends, not the actual girls, because they would never come up to you and tell you that they were done with you. It's the whistle blowing, bringing an end to my favorite part of the day, recess. Recess. And, here's the interesting part. Nobody remembers worksheet number 14 from their third grade math book, but you remember recess and all the things that came with it. You remember who you played with. You remember who you didn't play with. You remember how it felt. And that tells us something right there. As a principal and someone who's been in the school administration game since 2003, I've seen educational trends come and go. I've seen reading initiatives start up and fail. I've seen math frameworks to follow. I've seen standards shifts. I've seen testing cycles. Do we test in the fall? Do we test in the spring? Let's just test all year long. I've seen behavior systems put into place and fall out of place. But one of the quiet shifts that doesn't get enough attention, what do we do with recess? What have we done with recess? What we've done with recess. So today I want to unpack all of that. I want to unpack these things. Where recess actually came from and how it started to be, excuse me, how it was evolved or how it has evolved over the years. The debate about recess before or after lunch, that's always a big one. How recess shapes students socially, probably the most important thing we're going to talk about today. And why recess play is not just something that we fit in our day, it's really something foundational when it comes down to it. So this isn't going to be a lot of fluff and nostalgia. We kind of had that as we opened up. We talked about what recess reminds us of. What do we think of when we hear that word recess? This episode is really going to be more about student development. It's going to be about behavior, the school culture, and what kind of humans we're actually trying to shape. So let's jump in that way back time machine. Let's turn the clock back just a little bit. And let's travel back to when early American schools were really starting up. We're talking like the 1800s. And we know that model of education looked very different back then than it does today. Thank goodness. I can't imagine going to school back in the 1800s, but I bet it was kind of interesting at the same time. You think about, I'll just use Little House on the Prairie, or those black and white photos of students sitting in rows of desks, memorizing and reciting, memorizing and reciting, memorizing and reciting. And in that picture, you don't hear any sounds other than the sounds of silence. There was no talking. There was compliance. School was modeled more like a factory. We're talking that industrial revolution time, and you were told to sit still. You were there to absorb information. You were there to repeat it back to the teacher. Movement wasn't encouraged. It was actually seen as a distraction. It was seen as misbehavior. But here's what happened. As cities began to grow during that industrial revolution, schools became more crowded. Class sizes started to balloon, and kids were packed into buildings for long stretches of time of the day. And adults started noticing something. When kids sat for too long, guess what? Behavior problems started to increase. Imagine that. I know, shocking, right? So schools began allowing short recess breaks outside. That's where recess started fitting into the day. But let's be clear about something. The original purpose of recess was not developmental at all, okay? It was more from a managerial standpoint. It was more about teacher control and less about socialization. I don't think teachers and adults at schools in the 1800s Industrial Revolution time really cared about socialization of the kids. They just wanted them to be mindful and following rules and being good students. Quote, let's let them burn off some steam so they'll sit quietly again, was the kind of thinking that was behind the recess at this time. And that's an important distinction to make, because even today, sometimes that's still how we as administrators or even classroom teachers treat recess. Like, we got to get them up and moving. We got to get them out of their seats. Let's go outside. So fast forward into the early 1900s for just a bit. The progressive educational movement was beginning, and it begins challenging that rigid instruction. We need to make kids a little more studious, more academic. The educational thinkers of that time began arguing that children aren't just empty vessels, they're active learners. And the idea begins to emerge that maybe play does have some value in the school day, not just as a release valve, not, to get that movement out, but maybe a little bit for growth. So as we travel through the mid-1900s, recess was widely accepted in elementary schools. It became a little bit of a norm and a normal thing, even maybe expected at times. Often, recess was happening several times a day. For myself, if we catapult up into the 70s and early 80s, when I was in elementary school, I can remember having 3 recesses in my day, at least in the early grade levels, kindergarten, first, second grade. Well, kindergarten was half day, so not 3 recesses then. But definitely first, second, third grade, I can remember having that morning recess, a lunch recess, and an afternoon recess. And those morning and afternoon recesses were pretty short, probably 15, 20 minutes most. Your lunch recess was your longer period of time. But again, I can remember having 3 recesses during the day. So move past the 70s and the 80s and get into the 90s and early 2000s. And now the shift in education is high stakes accountability, high stakes tests, assessments, state assessments, federal assessments, standardized testing pressure. Instructional minutes became something that was sacred and that we couldn't waste 1 minute of them. And something had to give. What do you think that was? Most often, it was recess. That was the one thing that you could trim from your schedule and make up some of those minutes. I remember being in an early administrative meeting where the conversation sounded something like this. If we could just cut 10 minutes of recess, that's 50 more minutes a week of instructional time. I mean, that's good thinking, right? It sounded logical and meaningful. It sounded efficient and a little bit necessary. We need more time. We never have enough time. Was it data driven? I mean, we could dig up the research on why this was going to help catapult those test scores through the roof. I mean, maybe it might be in John Hattie's book. I'm not sure. We'll have to look it up and see. But here's what we didn't really calculate. When you cut out the movement, you don't eliminate the energy in the student. You simply displace it. And then that energy shows up in other places like the classroom when you're trying to increase that instructional time. So it shows up as fidgeting, in off-task behaviors and emotional regulation challenges, or maybe let's just call it dysregulation. We try to squeeze productivity out of these kids by shrinking their most natural developmental outlet. How smart was that of us? And we're still feeling that tension today. So, how has recess evolved? Let's talk about that and how it looks today compared to when many of us were kids. When I was young, recess felt a little bit unsupervised by the adults. We had the playground, we had some equipment, we had some adults who were mostly there to make sure that nobody broke a bone. I can remember most of the time the teachers would stand together, one, in pairs or however many there were outside. I was from a small elementary school of 2 sections per grade level, so those 2 teachers would bring us outside. At the same time, they'd stand and chit-chat, or what it looked to me as chit-chatting, and we ran the playground, and hopefully didn't get hurt in the process. Nowadays, recess is way more structured. I know a lot of schools talk about playground zones that they have kind of sectioned off for students. They have tight schedules to adhere to. Like first grade, you're going to go out and then you're going to come in, and then second grade, you're going to go out right after that. And you have to be out there at 9:02 because at, 9:23, second grade's coming out or whatever. Sometimes I've even heard of schools having lesson plans for recess. I'm not sure that I would go that far, but there's also like equipment rotations and sharing of things that have to be divvied up sometimes on playgrounds just because of budgetary issues. And there's all good reasons for all of that. There's great reasons for all that. But now I feel like we care more about inclusion for kids. That's a big part of recess too. Ever hear of the buddy bench? I bet every playground out there has a buddy bench. That was a cool concept. I don't know whose idea it was. I've had schools where I've had buddy benches at every single one of them. We label them as such and tell kids and teach them, like, when you need a friend, if somebody's not including you, you go sit on the buddy bench and somebody's going to come over and pick you to play with you. And that does happen most of the time. I feel like kids have a really soft heart for the buddy bench. And we also care more about safety nowadays. At our school, we practice recess procedures at the beginning of the year. We tell them how to use the slide properly. We go down the slide on our bottoms. We don't go down belly first. We don't try to run up the slides. I mean, we have a lot of set of rules and procedures for outdoors that we want our kids to follow because we want them to be safe. We, the grown-ups, understand even things like the bullying dynamics better because of recess. But here's where the tension can really start to ensue. The more that we, the adults, structure that recess process, the less it becomes authentic, free play for kids. And free play is different than organized activity, okay? When adults create the rules and we enforce the rules and we solve all the problems and disputes that the kids have, the kids themselves don't build the same type of social skills. Free play, when we allow it, forces kids to do things like negotiate the rules themselves. They can adjust to other people's ideas. They can actually handle disagreement because they're forced to. And they learn to manage disappointment, which is a great life skill to have. Kids need to feel disappointment so they know how to handle it. And those skills can be and should be messy. I'm going to just say that right now. When a kid's disappointed and they're trying to work through that, that's not something that's not going to be messy. It's going to be messy. There's going to be tears probably. And, this also means that recess in itself should be messy. It is and should be messy at times, at least. And sometimes as adults, we just want to clean up the messy stuff. We want to come in and fix things. I know I do that a lot too. But development is, and also should be, somewhat messy, at least at times. I've even seen schools where recess became so controlled by the adults that it looked almost like a PE class, so structured. And I've also seen schools where recess had zero intentional adult presence. Like I said, the adults standing around having conversations, they're on their phones, not paying a lick attention to what's going on around them. And neither of those extremes are going to work very well for you. I don't think that's any surprise. Kids need some space, but they also need coaching on how to use that space. I know I've had conversations to my staff before, like, we're not referees. We're facilitators. We need to be facilitators. And there's a big difference. A referee blows the whistle, they declare a winner of the game or whatever, the match. But a facilitator, they ask questions to find out what happened. That's one of the first questions. What happened? Maybe they ask, how could we solve this differently? They kind of coach you through these problems. What would make this fair? These are the kind of questions they pose. Recess is social curriculum at its roots. It really is. This is where our kids learn social norms, skills, coping skills. Recess is social curriculum at its root. And like any curriculum, it does need adult guidance, obviously, but not adult domination. Let that set for just a second. All right, let's move on to another, what I would call hot topic. And it's probably not as hot a topic today as it was maybe a decade ago, because even 2 decades ago, I think that's when this whole debate and research kind of surfaced and bubbled to the top about maybe we should do that lunchtime recess before lunch. There's a novel idea. Just so do we do recess before or after lunch? Let's talk about that. That's a great debate, and there's a divide among, can create a divide among staff really quickly, I think. Recess before lunch or after lunch, there's a lot of different aspects that we can consider. Traditionally, most schools have scheduled lunch first and then recess. There's some logic behind that. Basically, eat, then go play. I think sometimes it helps from a scheduling standpoint because it kind of helps like a rolling lunch schedule. Kids come in, they eat, they go outside. Kids come in, they eat, they go outside. Instead of having to go outside, come in and put your things away, go to lunchroom, a little more labored, I think, in that type of setup sometimes. But, like I said, over the last couple decades, the research started showing something very interesting to us administrators and teachers. When students have recess before lunch, they tend to eat more of their food. They're not in as big of a hurry. They waste less of their food. They, most of the time, come back to class a little more regulated, a little more calm, and they show better afternoon focus. So let's think about that from a kid's perspective for just a moment. If you know recess is coming after lunch, I know what I would do. I would rush. I would rather spend, if I've got this chunk of time for recess and lunch, I'm going to not waste my time in the lunchroom. I'm going to eat fast. I'm going to run outside so I get my social time. I'm going to talk fast. I'm going to eat fast. Probably throw half of my food away because I'm eating quick and I'm going to fill up faster that way. Your brain is already thinking about the outside. It's only natural. But what happens when we flip it and we send them outside and then bring them to the lunchroom? Well, here's what happens. They burn off some energy first. Then they begin to get hungry. Then they eat. And then they come back regulated to the classroom and more ready to learn for the remainder of their instructional day. We do recess before lunch at my school. We did recess before lunch where I came from previously. And I can remember when I made the decision to trial recess before lunch at one of my previous schools that I was principal of. And boy, that was a tough sell. Not so much to the teachers, because I don't think it really affected the teachers. It didn't. I mean, they have lunch and recess. It doesn't really matter to them for schedule purposes when the kids went. Cafeteria staff, I felt like was a hard sell. Like they had a hard time at first wrapping their head around, well, how are they gonna go to recess first and then lunch? I mean, at the school that I was at, it was really a perfect setup because the cafeteria had doors to the playground, so the kids could eat, throw their trays away, boom, go outside. Now, how are we gonna do this? It was a tough sell at first, but it was amazing how easily it worked. And it happened, and it continued, and I don't think it has ever changed since then at those schools that I've been at. It hasn't changed at my school. I've talked to other principals who swear by recess before lunch. And I've talked to others who tried it and ran into logistical headaches and nightmares. Things like, who's going to supervise cafeteria? transition. How are we going to get these kids to from recess to the lunchroom, and I don't know how it's going to work, or just even staffing and supervision issues. Again, like I said, supervision of the cafeteria and who's available. The concept isn't just philosophical by any means. It's really operational when it comes down to it. It's an operational issue, a building operational issue. But here's the bigger question that lies underneath the whole scheduling debate itself. Do we view recess as a reward, or do we view recess as a developmental right? Because if it's a reward, we'll schedule it around convenience. We'll figure it out. If it's a right, then we're going to schedule it around what's best for the students and the kids. And here's something else worth saying loudly and clearly. So let me clear my throat. Let's talk about withholding recess as a punishment for a minute. This is another kind of probably touchy area for a lot of people. Withholding recess as punishment is simply developmentally backward in thinking when you stop and think about it. I mean, it just is. If a child is dysregulated, impulsive, or struggling with behavior, whatever it is, the answer to that issue is rarely, let's remove movement from them. Let's restrict them from getting that out of their system. I mean, movement in itself is regulation. And now I will say, that doesn't mean behavior doesn't or shouldn't have consequences. I don't want to upset Principal Lamb because I know he's big on this, that there's got to be consequences for students' actions. I wholeheartedly believe that. Have I and do I use recess as a consequence? Yes. Sometimes you just have to. Sometimes it's the one thing that gets a student's attention. Or to me, if they made a mistake with a playground rule or procedure, then I feel like that's the one thing we need to limit or take away. Maybe it's just part of it. Maybe they do something different, like walk laps versus free play. But at the same time, do I need to work on finding alternatives to this? I think so. I mean, I think we all need to stop and think a minute about, should we take that away? I know, I believe in our health policies for our school board policies, it actually has some language in there about not taking recess away from kids as a consequence. So I know there's schools that are moving in that direction because of health and wellness policies. It just means that we administrators have to think carefully about which consequences make the most developmental sense for that student, for the behavior at that given time that they exhibited or that they have chosen. It's really all it's down to. And there's got to be probably some better alternatives than just the old, you're losing your recess today. So let's talk about the social power of recess for just a minute. And here we are, the heart of the episode. Recess is more social. It's all social if you think about it. And it's where social hierarchies start to form with kids. It's where leadership skills begin to emerge. It's where kindness is tested. It's where exclusion happens, unfortunately. And it's where, in the end, resilience is built and strengthened. In the classroom, interactions are structured, plain and simple. We have seats that are assigned. We have partners that are chosen by the teacher. We have groups that are curated and working together. But at recess, it's a different show. Kids do the organizing, or sometimes they self-organize. And that's powerful. Think about that for just a moment. That's real life, okay? That's reality. And recess is where a child learns things like, how do I enter a game that's already in progress? You ever think about that? A simple little notion like that? But they have to figure that out. They don't run up to the adult and say, how do I do this? They stop and process and think, how am I going to jump in here? Do I just jump in? Do I stop and ask, may I please play? They got to figure that out. Sometimes they learn it the hard way, but they learn it. They might learn things like, or try to answer questions like, what do I do when someone says no? There's a tough one. How do I handle losing? You can't always win. How do I repair or even respond after a conflict? There's always going to be some conflict on the playground, guaranteed. Those are adult level skills that they are learning in that process of recess. And they start and develop further on the playgrounds every single day. They start there and they develop further on those playgrounds. And here's the part that we don't romanticize enough. I like that word, romanticize. Here's the part that we don't romanticize enough. For some kids, recess can be the most stressful part of their day. All right. You think about that socially anxious child, the child who struggles with impulse control, maybe, or the child who is still learning emotional regulation. To those kids, recess can feel overwhelming. I mean, it can put them out of their comfort zone. I know we have some kids at our school that recess is just too much sometimes for them. And that's tough because we still put them out there in those situations. And maybe we need to think about some alternatives for some of these kids. So our role as the adult isn't and can't be to take over for those kids. Rather, we got to try to learn to scaffold for them a little bit. I mean, because we can't protect them all the time. There's going to be times in their life where it's going to be crowded and noisy and overstimulating. We got to scaffold recess time, just like we have to scaffold instruction for those students in the classroom. And maybe that means we need to do more things like, I don't know, pre-teaching some social strategies to kids, creating structured play options for some kids. Maybe free play isn't quite what this kid needs because he can't handle that situation. But maybe if we offer them something a little more structured, whether that be a game or, limit them to like, hey, we're going to play in the sandbox today and we're going to dig for some cool rocks and things. I can remember I had a PE teacher, really good PE teacher. Shout out to Heidi Collins. She was at a previous school that I was at as an administrator, and Heidi took it upon herself to begin teaching kids playground games and the rules of those games. She saw that there was a need for that, and she would introduce a new one about every week or every other week, teach the kids how to play it, take the things, if there was, materials or whatever that they needed to play that game. She would have those out at recess, and she used PE class to teach kids the game. And I thought that was so awesome because it really cut down on a lot of rule issues outside or, arguing about how to play the game because we taught you how to play the game. And it was just an awesome thing. I thought that was such a good thing to have that structure installed in the kids through PE and learning recess activities. It was a great idea. Maybe we need to assist in assigning peer buddies for students rather than just telling them to go sit at the buddy bench and wait for a friend to come, because sometimes those friends don't show up and that kid or that student is sitting on that buddy bench all by themselves all day long. So maybe we need to empower some other students to be the ambassadors for the buddy bench and, say, hey, when you see somebody over there, I need you to go check in on those kids and see what you can do to help get them off the buddy bench. Maybe we just need to do more coaching of conflict resolution. There's an idea in itself. And I feel like our building does a lot with that, with our school counselor, Kristen Alexander, and our teachers also model that and reinforce it in the classroom. But I think as educators as a whole, not just my building, I'm talking the country, we need to do more coaching of conflict resolution. We need to teach our kids how to resolve conflict in a peaceful way, not using our hands and feet, which often happens in my building, especially with kindergarten and first graders. I've seen incredible growth happen during recess when adults approach it intentionally, not just looking at it as I'm out here babysitting to make sure nobody gets hurt for the next 20 or 25 minutes, but they look at it as a social developmental time. And that's when things happen in a good way for students. If we want students who can collaborate as adults, we better value the space where that collaboration is first practice, the playground. So I'm just going to make a case for play one more time. Let's zoom out beyond the school logistics and the schedules just for a moment. Why does play matter neurologically? Well, if you look it up, the research tells us that play builds executive function in children, plain and simple. What does that mean? It means things like the development of impulse control or our working memory and flexible thinking. And those, my friends, are not bonus skills. Those, my friends, are life skills. So play also reduces stress hormones in kids and even adults. If you think about adults and we go out and do something fun, maybe it's just a walk, some physical activity, or we go play pickleball or go play catch with our kids, your stress level comes down. So play itself reduces stress hormones in kids. And kids do have stress, boys and girls, I guarantee it. In today's world, even elementary students carry stress. Sometimes we, the adults, put it on them. They have stressors like, academic pressures that either we put on them or they put on themselves. Obviously, family dynamics in today's world can cause stress for kids. How about technology overload? The cell phones, the devices that we are letting kids have access to. You don't think that's causing stress? Take a look again, okay? It's causing some stress. Unstructured play is protective. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Unstructured play is protective. When I say unstructured play is protective, what I mean literally is it protects kids. It protects their nervous system from that constant stress. It protects their confidence by giving them space to make decisions. It protects their resilience because they're actually learning to navigate small conflicts before life hands them bigger ones. All right, play isn't just fun, it's preventative. Self-directed play actually buffers kids against stress, anxiety, and emotional overload. Think of it like this. A buffer absorbs impact, right? So think about a shock absorber on a car. We'll take it to another level. You still hit bumps in the road, but you don't really feel every jolt at full force because of that shock absorber. It's a buffer. Kids hit bumps every day, especially at recess. That academic pressure, the peer drama, family stress, social comparison, performance expectations. Even elementary students carry more than we sometimes realize. But self-directed play is one of the only parts of their day where they're not being evaluated by the adults. They're not being corrected by the adults. Sometimes. They're not being graded or measured in any way. There's no rubric on the playground. Luckily for me, there wasn't, because I probably would have been at the bottom half. There's no score that goes in a grade book about their recess. I don't think I've ever seen a report card that talks about a letter grade or a score for how they do at recess. Kids get to make the decisions at recess. They get to change the rules, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. They get to experiment. They get to fail without it becoming a permanent issue or consequence. The autonomy that they experience allows their nervous system to reset. When a child runs, climbs, invents, explores, negotiates, and laughs, their body shifts out of that stress response mode. Their breathing slows down, their muscles release tension, the brain gets a break from that constant direction that we're giving them. That reset doesn't remove the stress in their life, but it does soften it just a little bit. It keeps the stress from stacking up without release. And over time, that matters. It really matters, because a child who has consistent opportunities to discharge stress through that movement and social play is less likely to carry that stress into the classroom as behavior or misbehavior or shutdown or emotional outbursts. So when we protect unstructured play, we're not protecting, quote, fun time, unquote. We're protecting regulation. We're protecting resilience, and we're protecting capacity to grow. And here's something else. Play actually builds and fosters creativity, and creativity is going to matter more in the next 20 years for those kiddos than compliance. I said what I said, and I'm going to say it again. Creativity is going to matter more in the next 20 years than compliance. Think about it, okay? Think about it for just a second. We're educating students right now for jobs that don't even exist yet, plain and simple. Okay, content knowledge does matter. Yes, I totally agree with that. But adaptability matters more, in my opinion. Play teaches that adaptability. Recess encourages that adaptability. And it teaches kids how to pivot when rules change, when life changes. how to invent new games when equipment breaks. You ever think about that? When something breaks on the playground and I'm playing with this for the last 3 months and all of a sudden it's not there, I got to figure out something new to do. I got to invent a new game. It teaches them how to compromise. We cannot say that we educate the whole child and then treat play like fluff. Quit treating recess and play like fluff. It's not fluff. Boys and girls, it is the foundation. Like we started this conversation, it is the foundation of our students and our children. Whew. All right. So after all that, what do we actually do with this all? Okay. Well, let's start with school leaders and administrators. If you're listening and you're a school leader, administrator, here's your short to-do list, okay? First off, protect recess time. Don't keep whittling it away. In fact, I would challenge you to look for more ways to add in some breaks in recess. And I'm not talking brain breaks. Teachers already do that in the classroom. And I do like brain breaks, and I think they serve their purpose, but they're not the same as recess because they're teacher directed, if you think about it, or whoever the video is, who the video of is leading the brain break. It's very directed, very structured. I'm talking about that unstructured playtime outside. Protect that recess time and try to find ways to whittle in some more. This whole episode and putting it together has definitely sparked some ideas in my mind. Like one thought I've had is because we only have that one recess, basically lunch recess, I've thought about what would it look like if we split that time in half and do a morning and an afternoon recess and maybe just do lunch separately, or maybe a short little 10-minute break before recess. I mean, the one thing that I've read and I really start to hang my hat on a little bit is, yep, we're taking time away from instruction, but maybe are we salvaging instruction time by giving those more frequent breaks and a couple extra breaks at recess time? I would be willing to try to experiment with that a little bit and see, like, if we add in a little more recess time, do we actually gain something on the backside because kids are more regulated, focused, and ready to learn? I don't know. It makes sense to me. But also leaders, administrators, train your recess supervisors intentionally. And I'll say, I think I'm guilty of this too. Hey, you got recess duty from 10 to 10:30. Go. We don't really talk to them about all the things that we really need them to do and what they're going to encounter when they're out there. And not to be so controlling, but to be coaching. Be coaches when you're outside. Look at your behavior data and think about, is there a pattern that you're seeing around days when maybe recess has been shortened? Something to think about. Maybe those 2-hour delay days. I know sometimes recess gets taken away, and I've even had that thought in my head myself. Why do they need recess when they've already had 2 hours? Maybe, because of fog or snow or ice or whatever. Is that logical? I don't know. Consider piloting recess before lunch if you haven't done that already. I think most schools do that nowadays because of the research, but you never know. If you're not there, try it. Talk to other schools and administrators around you that already do this to get some feedback. And lastly, gather student voice. Talk to your students. You'll be amazed at how insightful your students are, even at the elementary level. They're going to tell you what they think would work best. Now, sometimes it might be a little far-fetched, but it's still a good idea to listen to them. Listen to what they have to say. And lastly, administrators, stop automatically using recess removal as your go-to consequence. Yes, it does have to be an option in your arsenal sometimes, but it's not your only option in your arsenal. Okay, come up with some new things, some creative things, some restorative type practices to help with discipline and not just remove recess from the student or the student from recess. If you're a teacher, here is your little punch list of items to do. See recess as a partnership time, okay? Communicate with the supervisors that you work with about any social dynamics that you see in your classrooms or, that's happening with your students. Maybe like a heads up of like, these two might have an issue outside today. They've been kind of going at it in the classroom, so keep an eye on them. Those kind of things. That's probably the one easy thing to do as a teacher when it comes to recess. If you're a parent, I'm not going to leave you off the hook either. Ask your child, not just, hey, what did you learn today? We always know what they say. I don't know. I don't remember. But I bet if you'd ask them this, what did you play today at recess? What did you do at recess? Who did you play with at recess? How'd you feel at recess today? I'm going to guess you'll get some actual conversation out of them. And that's good conversation to have, because those answers are going to tell you a lot about their development and their day, as a parent. That's great information to have. So again, don't be afraid to ask them what they learned today. That's awesome. What are you learning about in school? But talk about recess as well. Talk about that social aspect. Here's what I know, boys and girls. When adults look back at school, we don't always remember the pacing guides, the curriculum, the worksheet number 14 from third grade math book, as I said before, but we remember the playground. We remember the laughter that we heard out there. We remember the scraped knees from the limestone playgrounds, the inside jokes. We remember the games that made zero sense at the time, but they meant everything to us. If school is preparation for life, I feel like that sentence itself is in some form of everybody's vision, mission statement that works at a school. School, our job is to prepare students for life. Okay, plain and simple. If that's the case, then recess cannot be and isn't an extra thing. It needs to be an essential thing. It's a must. It's a non-negotiable. It has to be. And we don't need less of it. We might actually need more of it. Okay, stop and think about that, boys and girls. We might need more recess for our kids. Maybe less screen time, more outside time. We need to understand the concept of recess better. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time, and that's where we're going to end today. We need to understand recess better. And with that, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Interventions and Detentions. If this episode resonated with you at all, share it with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the most important learning is the learning that happens outside at recess on the playground. Come back next week when I bring you another episode of Interventions and Detentions. This is your host, Brad, and this has been Interventions and Detentions. It's where the real learning begins. See you next week, everyone.